He always poured 2 cups of coffee, even though he'd been alone for years. There once was a man who lived like he was already dead, pouring 2 cups of coffee every morning, though no one ever came to share it. But then, a lost child, an uninvited breakfast, and an unnoticed act made him stay. And ever since, folks kept telling the story of the man who was only ever good at one thing: staying. The wind whipped across the barren land, stirring dust like smoke rising from years that had long since died. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky. The earth was cracked, its lines like the old veins on those who once believed in something but had given up. Eli Brennan rode a gaunt, hollow-eyed horse, each hooffall as heavy as stone. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, hiding a face weathered by sun, wind, and some unnamed sorrow that had lingered too long. He had nowhere left to go and no one left to walk away from. Behind him stretched a long wash of rock and dust, hoofprints scattered and soon lost to the wind, as if he himself wished to leave nothing behind. Ahead, a dry well rose from the sand, its stone walls stained and moss-blotched. A fallen tree slumped over it like it meant to bury some memory. Eli stopped, not out of thirst, just out of habit. He tied his horse with a frayed rope that looked close to breaking, pulled a tattered canvas bag from the saddle, and took out a blackened tin kettle. Same kettle, same old smell of ash and burnt coffee from 3 years back when his brother was still alive. Before the storm took everything, the barn, the past, and a name that once meant something. He lit a fire using 2 worn flintstones. Smoke rose thin and slow, like the breath of a man almost ready to go. The wind still blew. The ground was still dry, but that small flame was something he hadn't yet let go. Soon enough, the coffee boiled. He poured it into 2 cups, both chipped porcelain, one rimmed with a pale blue line, nearly faded away. He set 1 cup in front of himself. The other he placed across from him, on the stone, in the dust. No one sat there. Eli didn't look at it. He didn't explain, not even to himself. He took slow sips. The coffee was bitter as gall, but it was the one thing he hadn't quit, not after everything else fell apart. A small act, senseless, useless, but enough to keep him from turning to dust like the land around him. A bird croaked from a dry branch above. No one answered. Eli removed his hat and scratched his head. His hair had turned white back when he was 47. Now he didn't bother counting. He said nothing, just sat there like a rock that happened to drink coffee. An hour later, he stood, snuffed out the fire with cracked boots, brushed the dust from his shirt. No reason to linger, no one to wait for, no one to call his name. He turned to pack up the cup with the blue rim. His hand stopped. A small scorpion had crawled near that cup. It didn't touch it, just sat there, as if it too was having a sip. Eli looked at it for a long while. Then, instead of swatting it away like he used to, he quietly poured a little more coffee into the second cup, letting the dark liquid rise near the lip before slowly gathering his things. And just like that, Eli Brennan, a man with no one left to live for, paused a heartbeat longer in his leaving. No one knew why. No one needed to. Sometimes an unnamed gesture, like topping off a cup no one drinks from, is enough to make a man who no longer wants to live take one more breath. Bridger's Hollow was no longer a town, just a resting stop for those not quite dead yet. From afar, it looked like a body that had once been strong, now hunched and hobbling, leaning on splintered power poles like a crooked spine. The tin roofs leaked. The wooden boards had rotted. The windows were draped with thin curtains the color of watered-down soup, an apology, perhaps, to the sunlight trying to get in. Eli Brennan rode through the town gate and not a single head turned to look. Wind tossed old newspaper scraps from the blacksmith's porch across to the general store, like dry leaves still trying to rise again. There were no voices, just the creak of doors, the clop of hooves on gravel, and dust. Each step Eli's horse took, though slow, kicked up a thin trail of grit, as if even the town itself didn't want footprints staying too long. He stopped in front of a small shop. The door wasn't locked, just resting against the frame. No bell, no greeting. Inside he picked out exactly 3 things: a dry loaf of bread, a pouch of tobacco, and a packet of rusted nails lying near a basket of sprouting potatoes. The shopkeeper, a man thin as a leafless cactus, glanced at Eli, then silently tapped his fingers 3 times on the counter to signal the price in coins. No one asked anything. No one said anything. No one needed to know where Eli came from or where he was going. Eli laid the coins down, not because it was the right amount, but because he didn't want anyone talking about him later, a way of paying for silence, of buying the right to be forgotten. Leaving the store, he didn't ride out just yet. He circled around the west row of buildings, where once there'd been stables, now only an empty shed, and a fence leaning hard to one side remained. A child sat nearby, drawing nonsense on the wall with a charred stick. When the boy saw Eli ride past, he flung a small rock at his hat. Not hard, not mean, just a game. One children play when they've learned to scorn whoever the grown-ups no longer see. The rock struck the brim, knocking the hat to the ground. Eli didn't flinch, didn't look at the boy. He stepped forward, picked up his hat, brushed off the dust with a gentle pat, then put it back on, like it was just something between wind and stone. An old, worn-out man with nothing left to lose, walking through town like a ghost who still happened to breathe. A rib-thin dog lay under a porch nearby, lifted its head to watch him, then closed its eyes and drifted back to sleep, as if used to men like that, who only ever came to leave. By the time his shadow disappeared around the bend near the boarding house, the sun had tilted hard, its light draped thin as gauze over the rooftops. No one turned to look back. Bridger's Hollow didn't offer shelter, didn't turn people away. It simply didn't keep anyone, unless they knew how to patch their own leaking roof. The dirt road leading east from town curved gently along the slope, where withered cypress trees leaned into the wind like they were trying to balance between memory and survival. At the end of that road stood a boarding house. No proper sign, just a crooked piece of wood hung by twine, with Weston's hand-painted in peeling strokes, leaving behind white streaks like remnants of a belief once held. The front fence was broken in 3 places, each gate barred with splintered bamboo latches, warped by time and weather. On the porch, a rocking chair sat empty, layered with dust and the damp smell of wood, left too long in the shade. From within came the steady knock of hammer against roof, a rhythm not of defeat, but of quiet insistence. June Weston, the elder sister, stood atop a ladder repairing the sheet metal that had peeled loose. One hand braced, one hand hammered, the motion no longer steady, but just firm enough to keep the tin in place against the evening wind. She was neither tall nor strong, but carried the recklessness of someone who had no other choice. Below, in the yard, Lydia, the younger, tended the fire. A cast iron pot sat askew, its leg chipped. Smoke curled from damp firewood, stinging the eyes. Her hair was tied in a rush, her hands blackened with soot, her skirt stitched in 2 places. A little girl sat nearby, clumsily knitting, glancing toward her sister now and then looking away, afraid to interrupt. The boarding house held 4 rooms, a kitchen, and a rear porch facing a wild patch of weeds that passed for a garden. It wasn't grand, not clean in any hotel sense, but every part of it had been touched by hands and hidden tears. Dinner wasn't ready. The rice was running low. The meat had been turned away 3 days ago as nearly spoiled. But Lydia didn't complain, and June said nothing. When June stepped down from the ladder, Her hands blistered from scraping tin. She dropped onto the porch steps. The sun had just slipped behind the hills, leaving a band of red like a shallow wound. She looked toward her sister and lit a broken cigarette, not to smoke, just to hold, as if to fill the empty space between her lips. Lydia looked up, as if sensing her thoughts. She spoke a single sentence, not to lament, but to keep herself upright. "Don't count on anyone to feel sorry for us. Just don't let the kids see us scared." June didn't reply, but the way her eyes drifted toward the window, where a small pair of eyes watched from the other side, said enough. That boarding house wasn't waiting for guests. It didn't call out for anyone to come, but it lit a lamp every night, not out of hope, but because it couldn't go dark. On the table sat 3 bowls, turned upside down, ready for someone who would not arrive. In the corner stood an old suitcase, always kept shut, like a reminder. If tomorrow meant leaving, they'd already grown used to never keeping anything for long. The wind moved across the porch again. The chair rocked. Still, no one sat in it. That afternoon, the wind rose like a wild horse, lashing dust along the ridge behind the boarding house. A small cat, Calico, with an injured foreleg, slipped through a gap in the broken fence and vanished toward the cypress trees. Mason, Lydia's son, 8 years old, with eyes still as drought-season water, said nothing. He simply stood and followed the trail. He didn't run, didn't call out. He just walked. The wind whipped through his tangled brown hair. Dust thickened with every step. As the hill grew steeper, the boarding house behind faded from view, replaced by widening skies the color of tarnished brass. The cat was gone. Mason sat on a flat stone. His palms were scratched from thorn bushes. He didn't cry, just clutched a half-knitted wool sweater. His mother had started it for the cat a few days ago. In his hand was the cat's frayed collar, still faintly warm. The wind grew colder. The sun touched the ridge. There were no footsteps, no one calling his name. By the time Mason rose to head home, dusk had already blurred the edges of the world. And that was when he realized he no longer knew the way. He picked a direction that felt right until he spotted a wisp of smoke rising through the sparse trees. Thin but real, like a final signal from the world. The wooden shack emerged after a bend, quiet as a shadow on stone. No lights, no fence, nothing but the sound of wind scraping against its walls. Mason knocked softly, no reply. He knocked again, then pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, soft as a sigh. Eli Brennan sat near a small wood stove, coaxing flame out of kindling in the dark. He didn't look up, didn't ask. He merely tilted his head slightly toward the chair across from him. Mason stood in the doorway, small, windswept, with dirt on his cheeks and the expression of a child long used to being afraid without ever being held. Eli saw, but did not press. He removed the lid from a pot, pulled a bottle of warm milk from the side, something he'd been saving for himself on nights when sleep came slow. He poured it into a chipped ceramic cup and set it across from him on the empty chair. The boy sat down, cupping the milk with both hands. The rising steam fogged his glasses. He stared at the old man as if he were a gnarled tree that had stood so long. The sand had nearly swallowed its knees. Eli picked up an old blanket, patched but clean, and draped it over the boy's shoulders. Not tight, not bound, just enough to keep the night air off his skin. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind whispered without form. The fire crackled, casting flickers across Eli's lined face like a map of cracked earth. Mason sat quietly, fingers wrapped tight around the cat's collar. His face was still, but that hand was holding on to something that once had a name. Before sleep overtook him, Mason murmured a sentence, not clear if to himself or to someone else. "I thought this place was only for ghosts." Eli heard, but didn't answer. He just stayed seated, feeding the fire. And when the boy's head tilted into sleep against the chair, Eli reached over, picked up the empty cup, the one Mason had just finished, and set it beside his own coffee mug. 2 cups sitting silently side by side, as if to say, sometimes someone gets lost and ends up here, and stays not because they were asked to, but because no one told them to leave. Dawn came without fanfare. The sky held no clouds, just a veil of light mist draped over the hills, softening the sunlight enough to make visible each speck of dust, settled on the gray faded handle of the wooden door. Eli had risen early, not out of habit, but because he hadn't slept through the night in years. He sat still, staring at the dying fire, listening to the even breathing of the child, still curled beneath the blanket on the chair. The boy's shoulders were small, lifting with each breath as if his body was relearning how to trust that it was safe. Eli didn't know his name and didn't feel the need to ask. Outside, the early wind was cool, the earth damp, not from rain, but from the clinging breath of morning dew. Eli walked to the outdoor hearth and coaxed the fire back to life using leftover wood, not because he needed coffee, but because the boy might wake up hungry. While waiting for the water to boil, Eli took a sack of cornmeal from an old wooden shelf, stirred it gently in a cast-iron pot. He added a pinch of salt, just enough to warm the belly, not enough to stir memory. Footsteps behind him, slow, steady. The boy was awake, still wrapped in the blanket, but eyes wide, not timid, not confused, just quiet, as if he understood that this morning he had not been left behind. Eli placed the bowl of porridge on the wooden table. The boy sat down, ate in small spoonfuls. No one spoke, no thanks were needed. Breakfast ended with a cup of warm water. The boy wiped his mouth on his sleeve, then stood. Eli thought he might ask for the way back, but instead the boy gave a look, a clear one, that said he wanted to return to the boarding house. Eli nodded. He cinched the saddle straps, the old rope tied off in 2 tight knots. He led the horse into the yard. The boy climbed up behind him, not holding Eli, but not keeping his distance either. The ride back was short, past the dry slope, past low brush still glinting with dew. On the wind there was a faint sound like the chime of a broken wind bell, lost somewhere far from another porch. When the boarding house reappeared, its tin roof catching the early light, Eli felt something seize in his chest, as soft and sudden as an unfinished cough. Lydia was at the gate, eyes red, hair tangled, still in yesterday's clothes. She rushed forward and wrapped her son in her arms without a word. The boy placed something in her hand, the cat's collar now fully snapped, then stepped back and stood beside Eli. Lydia's eyes met Eli's. There was no blame, no thanks, only the look of a mother who had feared through the night, now able to breathe again, but unwilling to show it in front of her child. June stood behind the door, slightly ajar, a washcloth in her hand, still dry. Her eyes met her sister's, and something passed between them, understood without needing a name. She stepped out, looked at Eli. "Would you come in for breakfast?" Eli shook his head and turned to They go, but only managed a few steps before he stopped. That afternoon he returned with a torn burlap sack filled with a hammer, nails, rope, and a piece of old canvas. No one called, no one invited. He walked around to the back of the house and began fixing the broken fence, the one that had fallen during the last rainy season, and no one had the strength to mend. He hammered as if nothing had happened. Inside the porch, the boy watched through the crack of the door, holding a stuffed cat pulled from the old junk pile, and for the first time, smiled. From that morning on, Eli began returning every day. No one assigned him tasks, no one gave orders, but by the time the sun had climbed to the eaves, folks would find him behind the house, hammer in hand, eyes fixed on each gap in the warped wood as if he already knew exactly where the old boarding house breathed in and out. Some days he'd sit for hours under the porch, repairing the gate latch by hand, replacing twisted wire with a piece of scrap iron shaped carefully by his own tools. Other times he'd collect loose stones from the yard and lay them into a dry path to keep the children from slipping when the rains came. No one thought of him as idle, but no one ever saw him in a rush. Every noon, Lydia set 3 bowls on the dining table. She didn't call him, didn't speak, didn't fetch an extra chair. But when the meal was ready, Eli would walk in quietly, wash his hands at the spout behind the kitchen, hang his straw hat on its usual hook, and sit down. There were never many dishes, sometimes only cornmeal porridge, salted broth, and boiled greens in a hand-woven basket. But the meals were never hurried. The children whispered. June passed food with the care of someone weighing every movement so as not to press against another's weariness. Eli seldom spoke, but his grip on the chopsticks grew steadier each day. His bowl was always emptied, never too much, never asking for more. Once little Mason gave him half a roasted sweet potato charred on one side. Eli took it, didn't smile, but placed it on a chipped porcelain plate, like a gift that needed to rest in the right place. One evening, Lydia brought him a cup of coffee. She didn't ask if he drank it, didn't ask if he liked it strong or mild. She just poured, set it down, and left. Eli sat on the front steps with the cup in hand. On the wooden table beside him, he placed a second cup, a gray ceramic mug with a cracked rim. No one used it. No one cleared it away. June saw this one late afternoon. She stepped out with a basket of sewing in her arms and sat beside him, said nothing, just sat. Her eyes gazed far, toward the hills glowing orange like an old fire still smoldering. After a long pause, she glanced at Eli, then at the second cup. "Who's that one for?" Eli didn't answer. June didn't ask again. From that day on, every evening, June brought out another cup, set it beside the old one, and sat to mend Mason's shirts. No one called it routine, no one called it closeness. But the wind began to shift direction at the porch. Children in town, who once called him the man who buried his brother, now whispered Silverbeard when they saw him, a name just distant enough not to offend, just near enough not to fear. Eli didn't react to the name. But one day, when a child handed him a broken piece of biscuit meant as a share, he kept it in his coat pocket the whole day, uneaten. That night he placed the biscuit beside the second coffee cup. No one saw it, but that small gesture felt like setting down a quiet promise. In a world that had stayed silent for far too long, the seasonal winds shifted, carrying rumors uphill from the town square to the slope that led to the Weston boarding house. At first, it was just passing comments at the market stalls. "You seen that old Silverbeard still hanging around?" No one knows where he came from. For all we know, he's hiding from someone. Then came the lingering stares, too long to be polite, when June went to the market or Lydia took Mason to the blacksmith's shop for charcoal drawing lessons. People stopped stepping onto the boarding house porch, not out of disdain, but because Eli's silent presence unsettled them in a way they couldn't name. A man who didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't deny, but never explained. No one ever saw which room he slept in. No one ever saw him leave town. But the porch was straight again. The gate stood upright, and Mason had started laughing when he bounced his ball against the wall. That left folks unsure what to believe. On a Tuesday morning, with the sun still pale, a 2-wheeled carriage clattered up the hill. Its wheels beat a steady thump. The carriage was draped in deep red silk, with gold-painted lettering, studded black iron rims gleaming like polished threats. The smell of cheap cologne mingled with the stale bite of old gunpowder, an aroma of someone who lived by being noticed. Mayor Orly Combs stepped down, purple velvet vest, tilted felt hat, black shoes unstained by dust. With him came a man holding a leather case. No gun on his belt, but the sour posture of someone who'd won too many petty lawsuits with paperwork rather than pistol. Lydia was sweeping the yard. She froze. Dust curled around her skirt hem like it was trying to hold her back. June stood inside, one hand still gripping a broom, the other wiping flour from her brow. Orly marched up the steps, no greeting, no courtesy, just a statement sharp as iron. There's been a petition filed at the town office, a request for inspection of this establishment's operations. Lydia said nothing. June opened her mouth, meaning to speak, but Orly's eyes sliced through the moment like a blade. Under Clause 4, Article 7, any lodging house without a proper license, issued under a male proprietor's name, will be deemed invalid. Lydia's grip tightened on the broom. Orly smiled, a smile without fangs, but it still left a long bite. This is a land of law and tradition, Miss Lydia, of family standards. In the distance, Eli was hammering nails onto the back roof. The sound was steady. He didn't come forward. He didn't retreat. Orly glanced toward the old man's shadow up on the tin. That man, who is he here? No one answered. Orly patted his assistant's shoulder, pulled out a thick folder. We'll return in 10 days. Without proper documents, this place will be shut down. They left. Dust swirled behind the wheels, leaving on the porch a sheet of paper thinner than Faith, but just heavy, enough for the wind to carry it into the house. That night, dinner had no whispers, only the sound of spoons brushing bowl edges. The coffee cups, still 2 of them, sat on the table, but the warmth left them faster than usual. Eli didn't look at anyone, but when he stood to wash the dishes, his hand trembled slightly as he set the old cup on the rack. Under the table, Mason quietly handed him a dry towel. No one spoke, but in that moment, everyone knew something had cracked in the silence that had held them together for so long. That noon, the sun burned harsher than usual. The wind was still. The town sat beneath a thick blanket of dry dust, as if even the weather were holding its breath, waiting to see how much longer the Weston boarding house would stand. The kitchen was heavy with the scent of fried potatoes and wilted greens stirred with charred garlic. June, damp with sweat, worked at the stove, back soaked, but didn't stop. Lydia wiped the table in slow, even strokes, as if trying to smooth over something fraying inside. Eli stood out on the porch. In his hand, an old pair of pliers, the last nail still waiting for the windshield plank behind the chicken coop. But since morning he hadn't struck a single blow. He just stood there, staring at the boarding house door like a man who knew he had to walk in, but wasn't ready yet. When June's voice called out for the meal, not loud but enough, Eli stepped in, washed his hands, hung his hat on the usual hook, and sat in his place like every other day. Lunch that day included a dish of soft stewed beans, the kind the children liked, but everyone ate more slowly than usual. No one spoke. Spoons scraped bowls in dry clicks, like threadbare cords tightening under strain. Eli made it halfway through his bowl before setting his spoon down, hands folded, eyes fixed on the worn grain of the table. A long silence passed before he asked, without looking up, "If I put my name on the papers, will the law hold?" Lydia looked up, just briefly, but in her eyes surprise laced with caution, then softened, like it was a question she'd hoped for but never dared to expect. June said nothing, just placed a slice of cornbread on Eli's plate. Lydia nodded, her voice as low as a lullaby. "With a man's name on the papers, they'll stop circling." Eli drew a breath, not deep, but enough to lift his chest and let it fall again like a roof newly braced with fresh beams. He gave a short nod, firm, like a hammer striking post. Draining the last of his water, he rose, and as he turned toward the door, his hand rested lightly on the back of Mason's chair, then slipped away. He didn't speak, didn't grip, just a quiet touch, enough to make the boy stop tapping his spoon against the bowl. Outside, the sun had shifted westward. Eli fastened his belt again, buttoned the old sun-bleached shirt, then said, his back still turned to them, "We'll go tomorrow. Get the papers." The words drifted through the air like a promise that didn't need repeating. Inside, Lydia remained still, her hand resting where Eli had just sat, fingers trembling faintly. June stepped out a few beats later, paused in the kitchen doorway, her hand holding the coffee cup Eli hadn't touched that day. No one said thank you. No one dared, because everyone understood. That man had just taken one more step, not just for them, but maybe for himself. That night, when the wind returned, the boarding house gate stayed slightly open, and for the first time townsfolk walking past didn't turn their heads away. An old egg seller left a small basket at the porch, said nothing, just nodded at June. And that night, Mason slept so soundly, he didn't even kick off his blanket. The next morning, the sky was overcast. No rain, no sun, just a sheet of gray hanging over the town, as if even the heavens were holding back, cautious before a small shift that everyone could feel. Eli Brennan sat on the back steps of the house, hat shading half his face, a long piece of wood resting in his hand. He was carving, slow and steady. The blade was dull, but he shaved anyway, each stroke peeling not just bark, but something older and quieter he hadn't spoken in years. Mason sat across from him, holding a piece of chalk, drawing on the floorboards. He didn't ask questions, just glanced up now and then with that look children have when they're waiting, silently, for adults to believe they're old enough to be trusted with truths. A light wind passed through. Dried cypress leaves drifted down in slow spirals, like ash. After a while, when Eli paused to pour water into a tin cup, Mason spoke, not quite a question, more like a rope tossed across the space between them. "Did you ever have a home?" Eli didn't look at him. He drank a sip, then set the cup down. His hand, veins raised, skin thin, shook once, then steadied. His voice came rough and slow, not drawn out, just enough to flip over a stone and show the scar beneath. "Yeah, small farm, shared with my brother." He stopped. Wind hissed through the gap in the unfinished roof. Mason didn't look away. Eli continued, short, cracked phrases like broken bits of pottery kept in a pocket too long. "One night, heavy wind, horse gate broke. My brother ran out to tie it down. I couldn't hold the last rein." His hand clenched softly. The wood creaked under his palm. "That horse kicked him, broke his neck." No extra words, no tight throat, just a man speaking of a fracture in the floor that had long since dried. Mason said nothing, just set the chalk down and walked closer, sitting beside him. He didn't touch Eli, but sat near enough that the silence between them no longer meant being alone. A few minutes later, Lydia stepped outside with a tablecloth folded in her arms. She saw the two of them sitting close and knew not to interrupt, but she sat down on the third step, just far enough to give them space, just near enough to be part of it. Without looking at Eli, she said softly, a line of words light enough for the wind to carry away, but strong enough, if it stayed, to mean forgiveness. "We don't need perfect, just someone who stays." Eli didn't nod, didn't speak, but he set the blade down, turned the half-whittled piece of wood toward Mason, and gestured for the boy to go on. The sun didn't rise fully that day, just brushed the fence in the distance with a thin, pale line. But it was enough for their shadows, 3 of them, 3 ages, 3 faces not tied by blood, to stretch side by side across the brown earth. That evening during dinner, Lydia placed a porcelain cup in front of Eli. New, pale blue rim, not like the chipped ones he used. Not the second cup that always sat beside his, just one. For him. No words explained it, but everyone at the table understood. He no longer drank coffee for the one who was gone. He was beginning to drink it with those still here. Dry wind twisted dust up the porch steps, curling tight like a whisper, warning of something ill. The dogs that usually roamed near the stoop slunk under the house, ears flattened, as if they too had heard the footfalls of the storm before it broke. That morning the town of Bridger's Hollow held its breath. The clock in the general store seemed to tick slower, as if even time had paused to watch how long the Weston boarding house could stand. From the slope below town, wagon wheels ground over gravel, sharp and cold like razors on stone. Mayor Orley Combs's carriage arrived first, gleaming iron wheels, draped in red silk, but the stale scent of cheap cigars and ambition rose stronger than the dust it dragged behind. Close behind came a black carriage from the mining company, black as the hollow of an abandoned coal shaft. A man stepped out. Long coat whipping, high collar, polished leather heels clicking on stone. Not gunshots, but sharp enough to stiffen any spine. No weapon on him, only a silver chain dangling from his hip, catching the sun like a threat that didn't need to speak. Beside him, a regional clerk hugged a thick bundle of documents, eyes flitting like a predator's. Lydia, washing cups in the kitchen, froze when she caught sight of the carriages through the window. Water spilled over the basin, glittering like cold sweat on her brow. June pulled Clara into a corner, her hand tightening on the girl's small shoulder. Mason reached for Eli's hand, his small fingers trembling inside that calloused, steady grip. Orley climbed the steps, his polished shoes leaving a shine on the wood like a stain no one could scrub out. He didn't greet, just squinted at the three of them, lingering longest on Eli. "We're here to inspect the personnel and housing conditions," he said, voice smooth but edged like a dull blade. "Anonymous complaint claims this property is harboring an unidentified man and violating land use statutes." He paused, pulling a creased paper from his coat pocket, eyes flicking toward Lydia like he meant to dig something out of her past. "This boarding house sits on land that used to belong to a silver mine, correct? The mining company is seeking to reclaim usage rights. Without proper documentation, we are within our power to seize the property." Lydia gripped the glass in her hand so tight her knuckles turned white. June stood behind her, breathing short, but her eyes didn't leave Orley. Eli stepped out from the windswept back room. His faded shirt was stained with old paint. In his hand, a hammer, as if it were still the one thing he trusted most. He didn't rush, but every footstep landed like a nail driven deep into dirt. "This house," he said, voice gravel low but solid, "is now under my name." He set a sheaf of papers on the stone counter. Fresh signature, red seal, still damp, ink not yet dry. Orley lifted them, scanning slowly, his lips curling, not into a smile, but something close. "Eli Brennan," he said, tone dropping. "People say you were involved in a land dispute out in El Paso, back in '73, left behind a burned-out farm. That true?" Wind slipped in, stirring the curtain behind Lydia. Eli didn't blink. His left hand trembled slightly, but his gaze was locked, still as if holding time in place. "If you want this land," he said, words slow and measured like heartbeats, "you'll have to go through me. And I've lost enough to know there's nothing left that can make me step back." Orley stepped back, not out of fear, but like a man reassessing an old dog that still had teeth. He nodded toward the clerk, who scribbled furiously. "We'll return," Orley said. "This land won't be easy to keep." The carriage wheels rolled off. Dust trailed behind like a threat wrapped in silk. Lydia released the glass into the basin. Water splashed her wrists. She didn't cry, but her shoulders shook like she'd just slipped out of a trap that hadn't snapped shut in time. Mason clutched Eli's hand tighter, and in the boy's eyes, there was no trace left of a child lost on a hillside. Only the steady look of someone who had found the man who would not let the house fall. The last room at the end of the West Hall hadn't been properly touched in years. It used to belong to June's husband. After he died in a sudden bout of influenza, the door had been closed. Not locked, but never opened. And now Eli Brennan was sleeping there. No one assigned him the room. No forms, no words. Lydia had quietly mopped the floor. June had changed the sheets. And the night Orley and the sheriff rode away, Eli had simply stepped inside, softly, like a man who knew this house had long lacked the sound of a man's boots, but didn't want his steps to disturb old ghosts. The room had a north-facing window. At night, the wind slipped through, puffing the old cotton curtain like the rise of someone's chest just before a sigh. A fine crack ran down the ceiling beam above the bed, an iron-framed one with a curved headboard, once June's pride, carved from peachwood, soft and fragrant like memory. Eli didn't arrange anything in the room, just a worn canvas bag hung on a nail, his hammer set against the leg of the table, and a frayed handkerchief, freshly washed and neatly folded, placed atop the cabinet. That night, drizzle began to fall. Rain tapped gently on the tin roof, each drop steady like the quiet return of something long lost. Eli didn't sleep right away. He lay on his side, arm draped across his brow, watching the curtain shift in the breeze. At the foot of the bed curled the calico cat, Mason's cat, the one he'd gone searching for when he got lost. It had returned after 3 days, skinny, soaked, shivering. But now it slept soundly beside Eli, unafraid. In the next room, Mason whispered the alphabet to Clara. His child's voice softened with each letter until only the sound of turning pages and their quiet breaths remained. From the kitchen came the distant simmer of something on the stove. The scent of leftover cornbread drifted through the door, mingled with the smell of cinnamon from a ceramic jar Lydia had set by the hearth. The old boarding house no longer felt like something that needed defending. It had become, quietly, a place of healing, held together not by arguments or logic, but by the presence of people who, somewhere along the way, had stopped calling each other by name, but still hadn't left. Eli rose in the middle of the night and opened the window. Cold air came in, sharp but comforting. He laid the handkerchief on the windowsill to catch the mist, as if part of some small ritual. No one knew why he did it, but he did it every night. In the morning, June would find the cloth dry. She never asked. She simply replaced it with a stiffer one, folded clean and square, and set it back exactly where it had been, as if that, too, was what you did when someone in the house needed to keep something old that had been washed clean. That evening, Lydia showed Eli an old photograph taken on the porch 2 years prior. She set it on the dinner table beside the oil lamp. Eli leaned in. June held a younger Clara. Lydia stood behind, one hand resting on Mason's shoulder. 3 people, 1 picture. But in the far left corner, dim but visible, there was the shape of Eli, mid-motion, fixing the door handle. No one had known he'd been in the frame. No one had thought to call him out. Eli just nodded softly, then picked up a pencil and drew in a small figure beside himself, the curled body of the calico cat, and with that, the picture felt complete. That morning, Lydia noticed something strange. The 2 dogs that usually lingered near the porch had crawled under the house, their ears pinned back, tails tucked, as if something was about to fall from the sky, and it wouldn't be rain. Not long after, the mayor's carriage arrived in front of the house. Following close was the black wagon from the mining company, black as tar poured on dry earth. From it stepped a new man, not dressed in silk like the ones before. He wore a long coat, high collar, leather shoes tipped in steel. A silver chain hung from his hip. Not a weapon, not a set of cuffs, but it still made others stand straighter when they heard the faint metallic clink. The old sheriff didn't come this time. Only a regional agent with a thick leather satchel and a heavy folder of papers in hand. "We're here to inspect the residence and property conditions of this boarding house, per State Statute 42, Section 8, concerning questionable lodgings." Lydia tried to hold steady. June cradled Clara and retreated indoors. Mason reached for Eli's hand, trembling. "We received an anonymous tip," the man continued, "alleging illegal residency, possible human trafficking, harboring a wartime fugitive, and unpaid land taxes." Wind stirred down from the ridge. A few townsfolk stood at a distance, watching. No one spoke. The man in the coat walked a slow circle around the porch. In his hand, a small glass vial, not for samples, but for collecting dust from the walls, the roof, the ground. "I'm measuring lead traces. There may have been an unregistered surface mine on this property. If we find evidence, the state can reclaim it in the name of public safety." Lydia stepped forward. "This is our home. It has been for over 7 years. The man raised an eyebrow. "But the name on the deed belongs to someone who's no longer living, doesn't it?" He gave a dry smile. That line struck the air like a knife drawn across a quiet room. Mason hiccuped softly. June tightened her arms around Clara, and then Eli stepped out. From the room with the draft, wearing a sun-faded shirt, old paint still clinging to his fingers, as if he'd just repaired something that had long been broken. "This house," he said, calm and clear, "now bears my name." He placed a sealed document on the stone table in the yard, signed the day before. The man picked it up, read slowly. His eyes narrowed. "Eli Brennan." Eli nodded. "You were part of the withdrawal at El Paso, 1873? The wind kicked up. Pages fluttered. Eli didn't answer. He simply placed a hand on the edge of the table, left hand still trembling, but his gaze steady. "If you want this land," Eli said, slow and firm, "you'll have to go through me." Silence. "And if I have to, I'll sleep on the porch, in the barn, on the ground. I've lost enough people to know there's no one left I'm afraid to lose." The man in the coat smiled. Not with mockery, not with cruelty, but with the cool calculation of someone who'd just discovered an old dog might still bite. "We'll look into it further." And with that, the group left. Dust swirled in their wake, coating the porch Eli had swept that morning. When they disappeared down the road, Lydia broke. She hadn't cried when her husband died, hadn't sobbed when they were forced out of the last house. But today, she cried, because someone had finally stood up. Mason gripped Eli's hand tighter. He said nothing, but in his eyes, for the first time, he called the man beside him family. It rained the next morning. Not hard, no thunder, just heavy drops falling on the tin roof, tapping over the freshly patched seams like an old friend returning. The smell of damp earth rose from the porch and mingled with the scent of fresh coffee, making a person pause as if caught between something long lost and something just found again. Eli stood beneath the overhang, wrapped in a worn wool sweater, holding a clay-colored ceramic cup of coffee. The other cup, the second one, remained, as always, untouched. It sat where it always did, but it was empty. June stepped out from the kitchen, white flour dusting her apron. "You don't need that cup anymore?" she asked, her voice light as morning mist. Eli looked at the empty cup for a long while, then shook his head. "No," he said, settling onto the long bench across from the porch rail. "It's not for the ones who are gone anymore. It's for the ones who haven't left." Mason sat on the lower step, polishing a wooden toy rifle Eli had made for him days earlier. He didn't look up, but he heard every word. The rain continued to fall, soft, steady, rinsing away the dry dust Bridger's Hollow had worn all through the long season. Lydia came out with a half-finished wool scarf. Her hands no longer trembled. She stitched slowly, not fast, but even, and she didn't miss a thread. That scarf was something she'd meant to finish 2 winters ago. She never had. There hadn't seemed to be a reason, but now something in the house made people want to mend the things they once left unfinished. Behind Eli, the kitchen window was open. June placed a few wildflowers in a hollowed wooden vase, blooms that only appeared after rain. They blossomed just once a year. Locals called them the flowers that know how to stay, because when the rain ended, they didn't wither quickly, but kept their green a few weeks longer. Eli looked around the porch, the space that used to echo with so much emptiness. Even the wind felt hollow. Now there was someone splitting kindling, someone airing out towels, children tapping spoons on pots. He said nothing, just reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a stubby pencil, worn at both ends, and slowly he began to sketch along the edge of a porch post. A house, 3 grown-ups, 3 children, no names, no dates, just something that needed to stay. Years later, someone passed through the town of Bridger's Hollow. There wasn't much to see, still the dusty government street, a pharmacy that opened 3 days a week, and a saloon that now sold seed and rope. But the stranger heard a story. It wasn't written in any book, it wasn't carved into any stone. The one who told it was a man with a long scar down his cheek. His name was Mason. He lived in the old boarding house with a new tin roof and 2 rows of wildflowers blooming along the fence. "There was an old man who once lived here with my mama," Mason said, his eyes drifting toward the far hills. He came when the house was little more than leaning posts. No one knew who he was, but after he showed up, the cold left our home. The traveler asked, "Hey, and where'd he go?" Mason smiled. Not happy, not sad, just a look that held something grown quiet inside. "Maybe off fixing someone else's house. He wasn't much for talking, but he knew how to stay." No one knew exactly when Eli Brennan left. Only that one morning the long bench under the porch was empty. The second cup was no longer set out. The sketch on the porch beam had faded in the sun and rain, but Mason never painted over it. He left it there, as a way to remind whoever passed through that someone had come here, bringing nothing, and left behind more than words ever could. People kept telling the story. Out in places where only wind and red dust moved freely, they spoke of a silver-bearded man, back bent, hands steady, who showed up wherever houses were sagging and hearts had nearly given out. He never said, "I'll stay." He just stayed. When night fell, Mason poured 2 cups of coffee. One for himself, one for someone, maybe never coming back, maybe unseen, but never forgotten. The dry winds returned to Bridger's Hollow, carrying red dust down roads no one bothered sweeping. The Weston boarding house still stood, its tin roof catching sunlight like a quiet vow. The fence was straight now thanks to Eli's hands, even though he no longer showed up each day. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the brittle cypress ridge, a stranger appeared at the gate. No wagon, no luggage, just a dust-covered coat and boots worn down at the heels. He didn't knock, didn't call any names, just stood there, hands in pockets, eyes fixed on a curtain, swaying in the wind. Lydia, hanging laundry in the yard, paused. She wasn't afraid, but her fingers clenched the clothesline, as if holding on to something before it slipped away. June stepped out from the kitchen, a paring knife still in her hand, her gaze sharp, but not hostile. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, voice steady and low. The stranger didn't answer right away. He pulled a folded yellowed paper from his coat pocket. "I heard there was someone here who kept the fire going," he said, voice rough, like wind blowing through stones. I came to ask, is he still around? Mason, now a little taller, stood on the back porch, holding the calico cat in his arms. He didn't step forward, but something in his eyes lit up, as if the man's question had just brushed against something sacred he'd been carrying quietly. Lydia stepped closer, laid her hand on the gate. He's not here every day anymore, she said softly. But this house is still a home. The stranger nodded. No smile, no further questions. He placed the paper on the gatepost. A scrap with a few faint lines scribbled in, pencil, and a single smudged fingerprint in one corner. Then he turned and walked away, silent as he came, vanishing into the red dusk down the hill. That evening, under the light of an oil lamp, June unfolded the note. No words were clearly legible, just one line. Thank you for keeping the fire. Mason, sitting nearby, pointed to the corner. I've seen that drawing before, he said, his finger tracing a tiny sketch of a house, almost identical to the one Eli had once drawn on the porch post. Lydia said nothing. She folded the paper again and placed it inside a wooden box beside the family photograph. The night wind passed through, carrying the scent of wildflowers still clinging from last season's rain. The boarding house wasn't brightly lit, but the glow from its windows was just enough for someone, somewhere, to know this place was still alive and still waiting, even if no one said so.